You are listening to MCC Votes Seats, the podcast series of the Center for Political Science of Mathias Corvinus Collegium. We provide election insights with experts and politicians.
Dear listeners, this time we are going to talk about the 2022 general election in Serbia that was held on the 3rd of April to elect both the president and the members of the National Assembly. We have Mr. Miša Đurković with us, Principal Research Fellow at the Institute of European Studies in Belgrade. Good morning, Miša. How are you?
Good morning. Thank you for the invitation and pretty well.
Aleksandar Vučić has won a second term as president, initial projections suggested, and his Serbian Progressive Party, SNS, is on course to win a majority in parliament with its socialist partners. SNS had won the most votes and will presumably again dominate the 250-seat parliament, although it has lost its majority in both the National Assembly of Serbia and the capital, Belgrade. So the party will be forced to enter into coalitions with smaller parties. Let's start with the legislative election. SNS will remain the largest party in the parliament with around 43% of the vote. A long-time coalition partner of SNS, the Socialist Party of Serbia, led by the current president of the National Assembly, Ivica Dačić, is expected to win about 11.5%, thus reversing the trend of the decline in the number of votes. In the parliamentary elections, the United for Serbia coalition, the strongest opposition option, won around 13.7% of the votes, and the Green Left opposition coalition Moramo, in English We Must, won around 4.7%. Several right-wing options also crossed the threshold. Initially, parliamentary elections were scheduled to be in 2024. What do you think is the reason behind this decision, and why exactly April the 3rd?
It was very well known that regular presidential elections are supposed to come in April this year. So after the last parliamentary elections, which happened 2 years ago, Vučić immediately actually stated that the new parliamentary elections will be held the same day. And it happened even before the new government was formed, which unfortunately pretty much explained the position and the state of our institutions generally. In Serbia, SNS is totally dependent on his personal position, his personal decisions, and the way he co-opts certain people from different spheres, including other political parties. Actually, it was more or less one-party parliament, which, as you know, is not very usual and popular in Europe nowadays, and Serbia is a candidate for joining EU, and as you know, Copenhagen criteria state that there is a necessity of some democratic procedure. So actually it came out that even the only oppositional party which passed the threshold very soon merged to SNS, and it came out that the only oppositional, we had the parliament with only one oppositional MP, and this was Vladan Glišić, who stayed out of this merging. So it was very clear to Vučić that this kind of parliament doesn't have any legitimacy. This goal was fulfilled. Now we have opposition on the right side, on the left side. I think that this is return of the plurality within our political system, but I think that it will initiate also changes within the media, society system and so on, because this is for the first time that SNS doesn't have the full control of the parliament.
In 2020, the opposition largely boycotted the parliamentary election. Do you think those parties have learned the lessons since then and applied a new approach this time?
From their position, they think that they have done a good thing 2 years ago, because de facto avoiding of their participation or boycott really forced Vučić to go with new elections this year in definitely much different circumstances than it was 2 years ago, because for the first time opposition got some possibility to be presented at the media with the national frequencies. In technical terms, they got what they wanted. European Union involved directly in the process of mediation between the SNS and Vučić and the opposition, and they signed some agreement about the presentation in media, about the functionaries campaign. They got much better circumstances or conditions. The fact that Vučić's party got less than half of the votes is really some kind of goal of them. On the other hand, there is a lack of clear program at the opposition sphere. Especially, I think none of those political parties has developed infrastructure through the state. And I think that apart from SNS, who has very huge still massive support of and people everywhere around, because it controls all the local governments and then government in Vojvodina. Only SPS still has a decent party infrastructure.
SNS came to power in 2012 after forming a government with the Socialists. How could you describe the cooperation between the two main governing parties?
Actually, not only SPS, but G17, at that time also close partner of Tadić's previous government, changed the side and joined to SNS. We have to introduce importance of the foreign veto players, and these are European Union, Western embassies, and partly Russian influence. That is something like 10 to 20% when you compare with 80%, for example, of the foreign influence. Serbia is a relatively small or middle-sized country with important strategic position. And on the other hand, after 2000, since Serbia entered into the process of joining into EU, EU is in very big deal part of our internal political, legal, and otherwise structure. More or less, it was general decision of those foreign veto players to support this change in 2012, which started with the electing of the new government. These last 10 years were definitely defined by a rule of Mr. Vučić, who consolidated his personal power within first year and a half. And as you know, we had early elections in 2014 when he took position of prime minister. And since then, he almost had complete control of our internal political, economic, institutional, legal life until this election. Already in 2014, he didn't need SPS. On the other hand, it's not wise to have SPS as the opposition, because it is very organized party with still a best bureaucratic potential, with some people who have the experience of political fight for almost decades. And on the other hand, they were perceived, especially by foreign factors, as a kind of guarantee of Russian interest here, especially when we spoke about the energetic sector. There is generally very strong pressure on Serbia from the West, especially when the war in Ukraine started, to eliminate SPS from the government. And I think that there will be a lot of lobbying to try to avoid their presence. As somebody who is definitely significantly protecting in a way this kind of cooperation and very special relationship that Serbia has with Russians. On the other hand, SPS and Dačić himself made almost the whole campaign on necessity of avoiding the sanctions to the Russia, and I think that helped them to increase their voting potential from 7-8% to 12%. And the final decision of Vučić with whom he's going to make the government will very much depend on his final decision about future orientation of Serbian foreign politics, because for the time being he was working on the neutrality, as you know, good cooperation with Chinese, with Russia, with West as well. But I think that the pressure from the West will radically increase nowadays.
Talking about the internal debates and the foreign factor you have just briefly addressed, according to experts, there are constant attempts to undermine Mr. Vučić through joint actions that even include individuals from SNS, not just from the Socialists, who act in conjunction with a part of the foreign factor. Do you agree with such statement?
It's a bit complicated since the whole system of the ideological position of Mr. Vučić was very much going over what is usually perceived as a catch-all party. He really wanted to spread his capacities to cover almost the whole political scene. And he was trying to cover all the sectors within our political system. So it came out really in 2020 that the biggest opposition he had in the last 2.5 years was from his political parties. So in a way, you could see that there are very strong clashes between, let me say, pro-traditional part of his party, which is getting less and less significant, and pro-Western part of his party, which is becoming more and more significant, getting more power, and so on. For the time being, he was trying to balance that and also trying to use, let me say, special relationship with the specific parts of the opposition, sometimes pro-Russian or pro-traditionalist opposition. Those are those three lists who are now in the parliament, against pro-Western opposition and so on. We had the most radical internal dynamics, especially within the Vučić political party. And now, after the new elections, we might have new coalitions because those trajectories of ideological and value orientation are going far beyond political parties.
Okay, that's more than interesting. Let's turn to the presidential ballot and Mr. Vučić, who had won around 58% of votes, while his party, SNS, won only 43.5%. The main presidential challenger to Vučić, retired General Zdravko Ponoš, mustered only 18% of the votes. Vučić was elected president in 2017, as you already mentioned, faced mass protests during his first term, most notably between 2018 and 2020. How do you see Vučić's political position throughout the years?
He's in power de facto for 10 years already. It's quite much here for Serbia. Milošević spent like 10, 12 years in power. Then we had Koštunica and Tadić having the same, let me say, period in power, those so-called democratic forces. And now there is a Vučić who is already for 10 years. And I think if you take a look about the parliamentary elections, that this is the worst result they had as a party since 2014. There were voices internally that he was having big hesitation about going to the second mandate as a presidential leader. He was speculating about returning to position of prime minister to really get more executive power. At the end, it came out that he probably didn't find adequate person that would guarantee a clear victory within the first round, and he decided that he would candidate this strong victory and is in a great deal helped by SPS and with the Hungarian minority party, which also contributed with 1.5 or 2% of the votes, definitely. So in that sense, it is also clear that this is not his personal victory. This is victory of the joint coalition, and he has to take care upon that. His political position personally and his party is becoming less stable than it was before. I think that Vučić is personally less strong than he was before the elections. We could explain afterwards why he chose this strategy, I think because of Belgrade. Belgrade elections were very important for SNS, and you can see that those lists are entering with pro-Western opposition in negotiations about creating possible rule government in Belgrade. Although they were ideologically very opposed, but now they are starting about idea, something like happened in Hungary. So in that sense, I think that even political parties and factors that were more dependent opposition from Vučić and from SNS will be less dependent and more open for some other combination in the future.
Can we assess that Vučić is more popular than his party SNS? And also, has he achieved during his terms as head of state his main political goals, including economic recovery, infrastructural development, modernization, development of regional and international relations, as well as stopping the trend of immigration from Serbia and increasing the birth rate?
First, concerning his popularity, if SPS had its presidential candidate, he would definitely be at less than 50%, which is, I think, that his popularity is decreasing. It is still definitely biggest one. He's the most popular and the most powerful person in Serbia, especially when you compare with Zdravko Ponoš, for example, who was presidential candidate of opposition, and who, by the way, also got 5% more than his list during the campaign. And during the crisis of Ukraine, a majority of media that were close to regime or to Vučić's party were making big pro-Western, or let me say pro-NATO turn. Of course, he was trying to balance, but you could see the pendulum going into more pro-Western orientation, and that really annoyed people. And I think this is one of the reasons why simply his voters didn't want to follow this slight but visible pre-orientation toward pro-Western values. Also, when we speak about his political goals, he focused on modernization, especially when we speak about the infrastructure, about the roads, about the foreign investments, which helped development of Serbia. But part of the story is actually that a lot of those projects were started even before his government came to power. On the other hand, people who criticize him insist that actually foreign debt of Serbia and the level of the indebtedness of our GDP has almost doubled. The wages and the pensions have been increased. So in that sense, he really based the whole his campaign on, of course, peace and stability, which was slogan because of Ukraine, and on the further development and economic development in Serbia. On the other hand, Serbia has become even more economically centralized country, which is one of the biggest problems we have, that, for example, 100 kilometers from Novi Sad to Belgrade is producing 70% of our GDP, which is also increasing internal migration. Concerning the regional and international relations, I think that he is the most successful within that because he is following trajectories that were defined already after 2000. The most visible difference between Hungary and Serbia. Hungary, for example, as you know, developed very strong pro-family, very traditionalist politics, which is very popular in Serbia. Vučić went to the other side. Not only that Ms. Brnabić is representing actually these kind of new values, but last year especially we had big internal clash on those set of laws on gender equality, or radicalization on anti-discrimination law, and LGBT, we call that marriages, although it is cohabitation law. He passed this gender equality law, which is very unpopular among the not only ordinary people and even his voters actually. And concerning immigration, unfortunately, the whole region is facing very big, massive immigration of people, especially certain sectors like medical workers, doctors, physicians, IT sector, even bus drivers, and so on and so on. So Serbia is not the exclusion from that, and still we don't see how this could be really prevented in the future.
Now I can see that we have a very similar political agenda in Central Eastern Europe, regardless of the country we live in. Now that we have a clearer picture about Serbian politics, let's focus a bit on the management of the elections. The turnout was around 58%, which is higher than the previous ones. Vučić was quite proud of their campaign, which was, according to him, the cleanest and the most beautiful. Observers reported several irregularities, though, including photographing of ballots. The Serbian-based NGOs said that the voting day saw the complete complete collapse of the state administration. The NGOs reported violent incidents and irregularities, including alleged vote buying, closure of polling stations before all citizens had voted, and pressure on observer teams. Several opposition politicians were reportedly attacked at the voting stations. How did you see, what were the main slogans and program items for the parties that ran in the ballot? And also, how did the current Russo-Ukrainian war affect the campaign in Serbia?
Definitely, this is Balkans folklore, that there are always some kind of irregularities. I think that honestly, even oppositional representatives and leading figures will say that it was the most regular elections we had from 2012. If boycott of 2020 was wise, I think that also shows that opposition succeeded to get much better elections than they had 2 years ago. So that's why also Mr. Vučić is praising themselves that they didn't do slandering, and especially the way their media treated oppositional figures. There were massive campaigns before the elections process started and so on. The conditions for opposition were much better than there used to be. When we return to slogans, political programs, I think that Ponoš is right. War in Ukraine and the fears of people helped Vučić in the sense that actually, especially for Belgrade elections, those issues like ecology and ecological protests that were for the last year the most significant in Serbia were having much stronger support before Ukrainian issues started. Simply those issues disappeared from the agenda or were much less significant. And this is, I think, why Vučić got more votes in Belgrade than he was supposed to. Concerning the political programs and the slogans, just to illustrate some of them, SNS, Progressive Party, had the first slogan, which was "Together we can do everything." But very soon, as the war started in Ukraine, it was changed with peace, stability, Vučić, which was very wise.
Actually, we had the same slogans in Hungary for the ruling party.
Yeah, I know. SPS had a very clear message, Dačić Prime Minister, which sent a message to his people that he wants to increase the leverage, increase the ambition, and it also really helped. Opposition United for Serbia had the slogan, change from the roots, which was not very successful in that sense. I mean, the message is okay, but actually they could find something more attractive and more precise.
Maybe the society was not ready for a radical change in the midst of a war in Ukraine.
Absolutely. Vučić is a master of the political techniques. Unlike oppositional players, of whom rarely anybody has a really experience of the practical work and the field, understanding the need to adapt to the messages and so on. And I think they still have to learn quite a lot. Good slogan had the coalition NADA, which was made of DSS and this monarchist actually. The whole coalition is a NADA, meaning hope. And it was like hope for Serbia. They definitely had very good campaign, and this is the message that people liked quite a lot. And finally, concerning the war in Ukraine, I think that also changed quite a lot. It made very big burden for the opposition, especially pro-Western opposition. I mean, right-wing opposition was very clear on the position that they want to preserve the best possible relations of pro-Russian position, anti-NATO position, and it really helped them to increase their leverage and their position, while Western opposition, which was much stronger before and had their infrastructure, their media, their sources of financing and so on, simply was not very clear on Ukrainian issue. They wanted to avoid putting their position on that because on one hand they know that people are not really pro-Western or let me say pro-Ukrainian, and on the other hand they didn't want to enter into conflict with the Western embassies. So they tried to stay neutral and not to give any stance upon that. which was not, I think, very wise. Vučić addressed these issues with very precise message: neutrality, we want to stay out of that, we want to preserve peace, stability, and so on.
Going back to the competence of government and opposition party leaders, we have another similarity between our countries. But now let's turn to the possible new directions of Serbian politics in light of the elections. Serbia is almost entirely dependent on Russian gas, while its army maintains ties with Russia's military. Serbia will try to preserve friendly partnership, friendly relations in many areas with the Russian Federation. The Kremlin also supports Belgrade's opposition to the independence of Kosovo by blocking its membership to the United Nations. Experts say President Vučić has managed to turn Serbia from an object into a subject in international relations, primarily through the dialogue between Belgrade and Pristina. How do you see the future of the Belgrade-Pristina dialogue and the EU integration perspectives of Serbia in light of the recent general elections?
According to the estimation, since Vučić got the common support of SNS and SPS, we could expect the same government to stay in power. Some of the analysts indicated actually that he mentioned Dragan Đilas, his allegedly biggest political opponent, as somebody who was mentioned in a very positive way. And some people speculate that if Vučić decides to continue with this big turn toward the West, which is one of the possibilities, that might even see some unexpected turns, including some possibility of coalition, for example, with United for Serbia, or even with Moramo if it goes into very radical way. So Vučić succeeded putting himself within the center of the Serbian politics. All the internal options are open. And it will very much depend on his personal estimation, what will give or take more votes, more support of the people, or on the other hand, make problems with foreign factors. Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina are the only territories here which are not members of NATO. You could see that EU integrations were de facto moved from the scene while they were substituted for NATO integration. Montenegro in 2016 and North Macedonia, which changed the name for the case of joining NATO in 2017. So what we expect is further pressure on Serbia and Republika Srpska to slowly enter into process. And just one illustration, of course, we have this military cooperation with Russia and Belarus, some kind of common exercises twice in a year. But again, people should know that 90% of our international military cooperation is with NATO countries. I think that Vučić succeeded to prolong the whole this issue with Kosovo, which is, I think, the only thing that Serbia can do at this moment. Especially from German point of view, the whole Brussels dialogue was supposed to finish the issue by mutual, informal, or in the future formal recognition. And especially now with Kurti in power in Pristina, who is not very much interested in any kind of substantial dialogue apart from Serbia recognizing Kosovo, Vučić has a, let me say, ideal partner for prolonging this process on. As I stated already, Serbia is officially committed to the European integration. It even opened one cluster recently, but on the other hand, de facto, it's not a big issue for anybody in Serbia, and I think Vučić is personally the most interested to prolong the whole issue.
To conclude our conversation, let's talk a bit about the Hungarian relations. Péter Szijjártó, the Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade, explained that the election in Serbia was important for Hungarians for two reasons. On the one hand, because of the future of the ethnic Hungarian minority in Vojvodina, and on the other hand, because the two countries have worked very hard to turn their neighborly relations into a historical friendship. In addition, the ethnic minority party Alliance of Vojvodina Hungarians is a long-time supporter of the SNS and President Vučić. As of now, the Alliance of Vojvodina Hungarians managed to gain 5 mandates in the parliament. How do you see the future of the Serbo-Hungarian relations in light of the April the 3rd elections? And also, how would you describe the effectiveness and potential of the Alliance of Vojvodina Hungarians in both the National Assembly and the Vojvodina Parliament?
I think that Mr. Pastor or the pastors, both of them are doing great job for the whole Hungarian community, that they contributed significantly to make Hungarian minority bridge between two countries, and that generally, as we all know, the relationship between Serbs Hungarians hasn't been such a good for I don't know how long. Concerning practical relationship, visits at the highest level are very mutual, that a lot of practical things were solved immediately, and especially strong support that Orban is giving to Dodik and Republika Srpska concerning possible sanctions is also something which is very welcome and very well accepted among the Serbian people. What has happened in the last 10 years, including the general Serbian politics on minorities, which is, I think, the most liberal in Europe. And sometimes I think that we are exaggerating as a possible problem that, for example, Hungarian minority is less and less connected to the, let me say, general Serbian internal sphere and more connected to the general, let me say, Hungarian world and so on and so on. A lot of those people, especially young people, at the end go to Budapest and also to the West. So again, speaking about this massive immigration of especially young and educated people from here. But on the other hand, we also, in our internal educational system, made that actually you could be member of minority and pass the whole educational system, at the end finish with knowledge of Serbian language at the level of B1, which is totally crazy. I mean, if you have people with this kind of level of knowledge, he is not adequately prepared to function within this system economically, in any possible way. And this is not to blame on Hungarian or any other minority. This is to blame on Serbian general political, economic, legal system and so on. People, although generally relationship between two communities in Vojvodina, for example, between Serbs and Hungarians is really good. There are mixed marriages, people are functioning normally, and I think that popular culture is doing what education is not doing. But simply this is not good for making possibilities for those people to continue living and develop their life within the general public sphere in Serbia. And this is the biggest problem which we will definitely have to solve somehow, that very big investment and help that is coming from Hungary to the Hungarian community here, and which also helps, of course, Serbian economy and so, is not, unfortunately, still solving the problem of how to preserve Hungarian people within Vojvodina, and again, birth rate problem, which is very big for both of the communities.
So we have just identified the main tasks. Now let's hope the Serbian-Hungarian relations will continue to flourish. Miša Đurković, thank you very much for your time and for sharing your most appreciated views and explanations with regards to the 2022 Serbian general elections. It was really nice talking to you.
Thank you very much, Valent.
Dear listeners, you have been listening to the Votes and Seats podcast of the MCC Center for Political Studies. Thank you for following us. See you next time. Bye-bye.